circumstances. I was interviewing for a job here at Montana Western, and of course, Alan was the most senior member of the department, so stressful and intimidating. We became friends despite that initial start, and it's my honor to introduce him tonight. Alan came to Montana Western in 1991 and taught literature and creative writing, among other things, across 29 years, retiring in May of 2020. He notes that in retirement, he misses students and friends, but neither grading nor meetings. Across his career, Alan's the recipient of 2 Fulbright fellowships and 2 University of Montana Western International Faculty Awards, the first to Australia in 2003 and the second to France in 2010. More to our purpose tonight, Alan is the author of 4 chapbooks and 11 books, ranging from the memoir, A Father on an Island, Reflections on Loss, that's in 2008, through On the Beach, a collection of poems that came out this year, to the scholarly work Savage West, the life and fiction of Thomas Savage. Because 2 of his 3 children live abroad, he and his wife Lynn spend a great deal of time traveling, but he's here with us tonight, and I would like to welcome him.
For 6 feet people. Well, I'm honored to have you all here tonight. First of all, a lot of thanks. I'd like to thank my former department for organizing this thing and for naming Montana Western's long-standing visiting writer series after me, for God's sakes. And I'm looking forward to seeing how they will develop this series if we are in fact in post-COVID times, which perhaps to some extent we are. I'd particularly like to thank Ash Carlson for pile driving perhaps this particular occasion here. And I'm on a cold night, I'm really humbled by seeing a lot of friends here on the coldest night of the year perhaps so far. I'd also like to thank Lynn, who's been always my best cheerleader for what I've tried to do in this life. And so I've been retired for 2.5 years, and I'm no longer, it's great to see you guys. I'm no longer what I was for 40 years, but I realized one of the things I've learned is that I can still be a writer, even though I'm no longer a professor. And I'm what you call a minor leagues kind of guy. I'm not making big amounts of money from books, but by the way, Christmas is coming, and my dear friend Debbie, who is one of the best supporters of writers of all kinds that I've ever known, is once again being generous and present, and you can buy Christmas copies of any of these 3 little or not little books that I have now. So I'm also would thank Montana Western, which I'm glad Susan Briggs is here to hear me say this. Looking back, I just feel actually, despite a lot of problems along the way, and Julie Bullard knows what some of that sometimes checkered history has been around this place. I feel great and deep gratitude for the career that I had here. I was in this biz for 40 years, and then the last 29 were here. And in this small place, one has a lot of latitude, and you can do all kinds of things here as a faculty member that perhaps you haven't discovered that you might like to try doing until you're actually trying to do something and do something different. You might find yourself in a new direction that you hadn't anticipated at all. And I at least was able to try a lot of different things that I didn't know that I wanted to try until after I was in them. And the administration here and even more the colleagues make something like that possible. There are a lot of people here I love. Lynn and I are no longer part of this place. We don't live very far away, but we don't know much of what's going on. But we were awfully well treated here. My background was scholarly dude type, and I did not ever take a single creative writing class. I'm kind of proud of that. In a in a backhanded way. But 20 years and more ago, I realized that I was getting bored with trying to just do those kinds of things, and I wanted to try to branch out and engage in other kinds of writing. So that's what I've done. And I always liked fiction best, which of course explains why I've never tried to be a novelist or write a bunch of short stories or anything like that. I was first of all engaged by and attracted to personal essay writing, autobiographical writing, and in more recent years, travel writing. And then it wasn't really until middle age that I decided to try. And the stupid line I used to use is, since my books sell so well, I thought I'd go for broke and become a poet also, and start writing a lot of poetry. And particularly for all people here, but particularly for the students who might be here, I would just remind us that, as I used to always try to teach, writing contains power and pleasure that nothing else in our human experience gives us, actually. And there's first and last a deep kind of joy that comes from trying to write stuff. And I've discovered, for me, in the last 15 years, particularly, that the pleasure of trying to get a poem that is decent is a different pleasure than trying to get an essay, or more than an essay. For me, looking back, kind of my breakout book was A Father in an Island, which is a memoir book. It's basically the biography of my father's life after he died of Lou Gehrig's disease. And that took me to the cleaners and back. It took 8 years and a whole box of rejections before that ever saw the light of day, and I wasn't sure it was going to. But once that came out about 15 years ago, then I wasn't embarrassed to call myself a writer, and I've tried not to look back. So I thought I'd just give a sampling tonight. Start with a little bit of poetry, go to a little prose, and then go back and a little more time on poetry. If anybody has any questions or comments, please interrupt. If you have complaints, keep that for later. Thanks for laughing. So this last year I've been fairly lucky. I've had a couple of chapbooks published. This poetry chapbook called Through the Basement of Time, and I stole the title from Norman Maclean, and the river runs through it on the last page. I've supplied the preposition. The basement of time is Norman's phrase. And as perhaps some of you might agree, when I used to teach Maclean, and I've written stuff on him, I would say to writing students particularly, you don't get to write that well very often. Maybe once in your career, do you write as well as Norman did in old age on the last couple of pages of A River Runs Through It? And I got to the stage where I was actually entirely emotional and couldn't read it anymore in class or talk about it particularly. But this is, for me, as perhaps for some of you, it's just off the chart. It's kind of off the chart. And then I will read a little bit of this kind of sad story called When the Smile Stopped. And then I will spend more time on this handsome and mighty fine looking new poetry collection called On the Beach, which just came out a few months ago. So 3.5 years ago, I got to go on a Grand Canyon Colorado River raft trip, which was a pre-bucket list thing for me. Have any of you guys been down the Colorado? Here? Right. And our younger son, he was kind of Joel was at a river rat stage, so he was a guide, but he got off from his regular guide gig so he could go with me. So part of the energy of this was father-son. And I only knew a couple of people from this group, most of them living then in Reno or Lake Tahoe area, and they became besties. And it is simply one of the best trip experiences I've ever had. And if any of you are attracted to ancient rock or white water, I recommend spending the money and going with a commercial outfit that takes care of all the white water, does all the cooking, provides a generous and long happy hour and things like that. But I kept a lot of, I would get up at 4:30 in the morning and try to journal because I'd always wanted to be going down these 226 miles and finally got to. So I'll just read three little poems from this collection. The first poem, fairly in the upper river, you come to the junction of the Little Colorado, which flows into the main Colorado from east-southeast, and it's an entirely different color. It's a really bright blue, and there's a lot of silicon carbonate. I'm saying this wrong. I'm glad Rob Thomas isn't here. It's a different color. It's a different temperature. It's much warmer than the main Colorado River, and it's an opportunity, it turns out, for a lot of play when adults can become kids again. So this is number 8. Up the Little Colorado River, we pad its calcium carbonate load, yielding robin egg blue, and we squint behind sunglasses. We tie our PFDs as adult depends, then slip in, hook feet into armpits just ahead, ride rapids, gentle rapids in body trains, twist not to uncouple, laughter rising to the sky, and we shed decades and bob along. Let's do it again and again. One guide, Sean, gave this group an assignment, which pleased me to know, and he asked everybody to write a poem about something. So those who might not generally try to write poems were trying to write a poem. And I kept mine because I thought it was half decent. And it's about a kind of cactus, hedgehog cactus. Do any of you people know what a hedgehog cactus looks like? It's a lot smaller than saguaro, a lot fatter than, I just lost cholla. Anyway, this is just called hedgehog. A poor man's saguaro, or maybe a mini me along the North Bass Trail, a garden of bouquets, but hedgehog? Those wobble, keep predators at bay, but not laughter. Their spikes radial, erect, a guarding fortress. But this cactus branches towards the sky, a splay of stems, easy on curves, like a candelabra, a composed cluster whose arms arc like a teddy bear's forelegs, easy ascent airwards, their shape a definition of aspiration, a calm grouping in a sere land aspiring to the far sky. And just one more from this little thing. My favorite part of the Grand Canyon trip actually consists in the little side hikes that you take up these slot canyons, where you're in these giant sort of crevasses, and you're not only going way back in time, but you're entering some kind of womb condition. And in this desert, these are places where there are suddenly these miniature tropical oases of fresh water. And this is one of those. Kanab Creek flows south from near the town of Kanab over the line in Utah, and it's actually a fairly big drainage that comes into the Grand Canyon more than halfway down the commercial trips. So this is about that place. And Chad is the name of one of the guides. Kanab Creek flows through wide Kanab Canyon, which winds north out of the park. A bighorn ram, ewe, and 2 kids pause 100 meters away, and we watch one another. In a broad bend, Muav limestone has recorded and shaped a long alcove perfectly curved with a flat stone row or two above the sun-shot creek. Viewing platform for small talk or snacks or sleep. Some follow Chad around boulders up creek and then east to Whispering Falls. Usual suite of cool pool, grotto, a runnel at least 100 feet down flat stone hanging gardens, and in the Omphalos we stroke the pool, pose in grotto, eat, nap, our dreams abetted by the whisper of water, the embrace of stone. So we're one third of the way through the show here. So this isn't a very happy story, but I worked really hard on this long essay called When the Smile Stopped. And as a few friends in this room know, this is actually the story of my older brother. I changed the names in the text. And I rewrote this a lot. And I intended this actually for any of us who happen to have a relative or a friend who suffers from clinical depression that might remain untreated. And that's the story of my older sibling. So I just will read the beginning of When the Smile Stopped. And first of all, a shout out to Shane Borman. He was one of several writer friends who helped me edit and push me to revise this yet again. So this is the first part of When the Smile Stopped. And you will recognize the first lines, I think. Mom died. We sold the house. Our older brother disowned us. Now we live with an arm cut off. When a brother disowns you, it's another death in the family. And perhaps it's not your fault. Fault isn't the right word, though. It's more complicated than that. And a river runs through it. The Reverend McLean speaks in one of his homilies about how those we love the most, we can least help. He talks, or at least McLean as narrator has him talk, about a problem that faces you and you lack the right tool or right size tool in your kit to repair the problem. Neither the Reverend nor Norman can repair Paul any more than I can change my older brother. Maybe he could not change. He doesn't speak of it or make any moves. He was part of a generally happy family, but happiness eluded Ron like the sun in Puget Sound winters. My parents bore his discontent a heavy black coat until their deaths. Bill, my younger brother, and I faltered. In our own lives, with our own families, we didn't know enough, or we didn't pay the right kind of attention. We were rebuffed. We grew up with the thin shadow of a sister who died just short of her 3rd birthday and who would have been the oldest. She's a ghost. Instead, Ron plays the part of oldest in the brothers' Weltzien. His resemblance to Dad surfaces infrequently and offsets his somber colors. I've met few I'd call brilliant, a sloppy compliment about someone who's exceptionally bright. But I grew up with an older brother who showed brilliant potential. I still shake my head, hear his bright high school voice. Mom occasionally told the story of Ronnie before age 5, naming every single car model on the road. Old relatives nodded at his precocity, and grandfather Weltzien shook his head. The parable of the talents is usually pitched as a lesson in stewardship, in the wise use of gifts. The master gives 3 students varying amounts of talents, a coin worth a lot of money, 2 of whom invest their gifts and grow them. The 3rd servant, who's given 1 talent and buries it, is punished. Quote, for unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he shall have abundance, but from him that hath not shall be taken away, even that which he hath. End quote. The prudent 3rd servant gets screwed. In other words, spend to increase, don't save. My brother was given exceptional talents, but it got complicated. Coins tarnished, and he buried them. Mom said, he could have been anything he wanted. It's true. I sighed with her, replaying that song of lost potential. He should have been a famous academic at a top university, commanded far more attention than I've ever managed. Instead, he acted different. When I was tagging behind him through school, I wasn't tuned in to his social awkwardness, his stiff manner, elaborate vocabulary, disinterest in sports and hobbies, his single abiding passion, or occasionally averted gaze. I couldn't see past the folks' easy sociability or my shyness, which I masked with my busy tongue, inside my brother's reserve, let alone fathom any reasons for it. Ron ignored social cues, either because he didn't register them or didn't care. The seeds of a social life grew slowly in his stony soil. As his adulthood unfurled, he lived between music and silence, or near silence. We share so much genetic material, so many personality strands, that he is like another version of me, a shadow. But I lacked his bank of reserve, his miscues, and blanket indifference to most peers. He's moved further and further away, and I can't see my shadow. A common story of close siblings, wherein problems inside one and the tidal shift of adulthood together open a widening gap. I'll stop there. So that's pretty tough, but I think, well, that's stupid to say. My wife and others have told me that clinical depression is now the new fifth vital sign, and perhaps even before COVID, clinical depression, as you guys may know, has reached epidemic proportions. And 2 generations ago, since I notice I'm old now, supposedly, that wasn't even a common diagnosis. In fact, until the 1980s, before the 1980s, it was called anxiety. And my parents weren't stupid people, but when I was writing this over and over again and trying to, since I noticed I've been a father for a long time, I was trying to imagine my parents a lot more and trying to figure out what, if anything, they could have done differently. Because I think by the time I was just 1 grade behind, and I don't know if this is true for any of you as siblings, but they knew something was way off, whatever the spectrum of normal is. Something was way off by high school. And to my knowledge, they didn't do much about it. And this is also a case, and maybe you guys know this case as well, of the child who becomes an adult child who frankly never leaves home, stays home. And that's pretty much how it went until we had to sell the home. And then he disowned us. And that happened about 7 or 8 years ago. And in his narrative, we kicked him out. He knew he was outvoted, and what the other sibling and I used to think was emotional blackmail of perhaps 40 years ended. And that's probably an unfair judgment too, but that's what it felt like. But let's move on. So I said earlier, I think, as my friend Ron knows, there's a peculiar, intense pleasure one can get from trying to write poems. And it's fun to early draft them. It's also fun to revise them. It's different than revision with prose, but it's just a blast. And I hope that writing poetry has, in the last 15 or 20 years, has improved my prose. Although it seems in my case, I've had a little bit better luck publishing poetry than prose, but I try not to dwell on that too much. So this collection, this is from a press in Anchorage, Alaska. I don't know if I told you that, Christy, but Cirque Press. And I like their list. They have a really terrific journal. They've been kind enough to accept a couple of poems of mine for the last several years of issues. And so I was looking at their book list and decided to try to go with them. And I also got some of the best editing that I've ever had with a poetry book from the people at this particular press. So this is organized into 5 sections. And what I thought I'd do is just try to read. Hi, Dan. Nice to come. I'm going to read it, just a few from each section. And I was trying to pick out poems that are either geographically close by or that have something to do with the college or the former life that I notice I led here at this college. So this first poem is about Butte. What can you say? And do you remember when Butte is Montana, otherwise you're just camping, according to that cartoon I saw 30 years ago. And my friend Tom Satterley thinks that's the absolute truth. So in the Berkeley Pit, we have these episodes where snow geese land and they start watering and feeding, and then that's it for the snow geese. And so this poem concerns one of those occasions within the last 10 years. And this is a bad pun of a title. It's called Heavy Metal. Shifting cues delay migrations. A snowstorm pushes 3,000 snow geese into Berkeley Pit's anti-lake, quote, a 50 billion gallon toxic stew, end quote, to water and feed and die. Flat surface below, ochre tiers curve and twist, a poisonous tide surge governed by no moon. The water, unlike any other, beckons birds, a siren trap that folds their broad white wings. Angelic canaries in the open pit, remnant of the mines, yawning maw that ate East Butte, whose wet gorge rises. Some of you might remember Nolan Silex, who taught art here off and on, and he did a whole really neat series of paintings on copper about the Berkeley Pit. And I intended this to go with one of his paintings, and in a gallery in Uptown, they actually put them together for a while. A little of that interdisciplinarity going on. If Carl Ulrich were here, this is for Carl, who was the provost here for many years, too many years. I didn't say that. This is called teacher evaluation, and this actually happened out near Main Hall. I used to like to take classes outside and be liberated in my dotage. So this is teacher evaluation. It was an upper level class. I wave my hands, aim for eloquence, my back to the tree trunk. The upper level class camped about me when the passing bird shits on my tan pants. No student receives the baptism, and I pause, focused on early Neruda, announce, I've been shat upon, eager to use the old past tense. I point to the white blotch mid-thigh, and students chuckle. I say, after all these years, the most succinct comment on my pedagogy I've ever seen. During the break, I rush to the provost, old friend, eager to show and tell. This mundane lesson, gravity's surprise, punctures my persona. There was a great writer in Portland named Brian Doyle, a fabulous writer who died tragically at the age of 51, I think, and he was writing nonfiction and fiction. And I didn't discover Brian Doyle till nearly his death 5 years ago, and started reading this guy. And I was so turned on by some of what he was trying to do that this poem is a little bit in the spirit of some of what he wrote. We have, Lynn and I have a daughter and 2 sons. So this is about the sons, and it's called Tumbling with Sons. When they were toddlers, almost a decade apart, both sons waited to wrestle with me. I lay on the floor, they crawled over me, and I extended my arms, my legs or arms, and tossed them up until I couldn't. And we kneeled and bumped, and I rode them around the room, bucked and jerked, and they hooted and giggled. And they asked for more until they trudged off to play adventures. Soon enough, in their lengthening, they no longer asked, and I sometimes remember our entwined bodies, their hot skin on mine, and I know this is as good as it gets. This is a little prose poem that happened, I think, within the last decade of my career here. And it's called Young Mother. This isn't a happy poem. The young crow woman eases into a chair, joins a small group in the white class, tells me, "My son is 2 months old, but I want to continue my education." A father of 3, I melt. She nurses him, and when problems arise, she flies to him. She says, "The father is back home on the res." I tell her, "I sympathize. I want you to succeed, but you have to do the same work as everyone." My knee-jerk fairness standard bores me. She comes when she can, but sits silent, listens even when we discuss Sarah Winnemucca or Zit Kalasa. Is her quiet her respect? When I ask, she says, "It's interesting to hear what others think." Her papers show a recent voice who anchors herself now and then in standard American English. She arrives late, leaves early, misses, and I, helpless, want to change the plot. Surprise us both, close the gap between past and this academic present, a bright light. But she fails, and part of me protests this prescripted tragedy. I fail too. This poem came from the coronavirus part of our life, and Shane Borman has seen this before and helped me out also. It's called A Poem from the Plague Year, and that's a little nod back to some dude named Daniel Defoe in the early 18th century who wrote a whole book called the Journal of the Plague Year about the 1665 plague in London. A poem from the plague year. 8 months into the pandemic, a gray rat scurries into the garage through the fat gap below the door. The rat wriggles in and out a new home, and I distribute turquoise poison pellets inside. Remember Kafka's cockroach and giant mole when I track the rat's sturdy tail. No rat has moved in since. The rat hustles like a bad dream, eats the poison, leaves no trace. Does anybody have any questions or comments or jokes or anything here? Are we staying warm enough?
Did you really have a rat?
Yeah. Never had a rat genie in that whole time. I thought, holy shit, there's a rat.
Maybe it was a mouse and you were just.
No, this was, no, I'm afraid this was a rat. And I got very discouraged about our standards around the house. What's happening? And as I have mentioned, I retired 2.5 years ago, and I wrote a couple poems about what that felt like. And this is one of them. It's the shorter one. So the longer one is called, which you will see, of course, when you buy this book, as soon as Weltzien gets done with this deal, On Giving Away Most of My Library, which was difficult. I gifted about 2/3 of the books to the Dillon Public Library. So Lynn and I feel pretty good about that. This poem is called Final Days. I upload a last audio, read the final papers, file grades all online. I've stolen into the office weekends, carted dozens of boxes, tossed files, a remote ghost already, though I blink. And the first days in Montana dance, and before those, a decade in Virginia, when I learned to teach, eventually write, and confidence blossomed. I relinquish my role as wannabe sage, no more captive audiences, no longer one who professes, unsure what verbs I will inhabit in the wide space before me, my work voice stilled. So former colleagues, someday you get to write that. Okay. Our Lynn and I like to travel a lot. Our older son and daughter-in-law live in Munich now. They're in the Foreign Service, and so they'll never be in the U.S. And our daughter has lived in Manila in the Philippines for 5 or 6 years now, and she's an elementary school counselor at the fanciest prep school in the whole dang country. So, and before then, she worked, before the Philippines, she worked in this country called Myanmar, and which has gotten all closed down again. And it just seems unbelievable that we actually got to visit that country and travel around. You know, there was a window, wasn't there, of 20 years or less when it was actually opening up. And it's remained, you know, Myanmar, the poorest country in Southeast Asia, and it's all apparently international tourism, eco or otherwise, does not matter to the junta there. That slaughter, as you may know, goes on and on and on, mostly off the radar of Western press. This poem comes from a trip in the Philippines. I try to go with a guide, and because I'm kind of stuck on volcanoes. I wrote a book about the Pacific Northwest volcanoes some years ago, and I'm no volcanologist, and I wouldn't pass one of Rob Thomas's classes, but I grew up looking at Mount Rainier. I'm a Seattle area kid originally, and I like volcanoes a lot. And the Philippines has a lot of volcanoes because it's on the Pacific Ring of Fire. And this experience came from visiting Pinatubo. And in 1991, Pinatubo erupted for a month, and it was the largest volcanic explosion, the second largest in the 20th century, it turns out. And a lot of local people were completely displaced. And this experience came after visiting Pinatubo. It's called Confessional. I had an abortion 5 months ago, Maria tells me, in our Filipino tricycle. My lover is an architect, and I knew he didn't love me enough. I didn't tell my parents for 2 weeks after my 30th birthday. She says, I tire of the clouds and rain in Brussels. I much prefer Southeast Asia. I had no idea how bad it would be. I lost weight, fell sick. Maria declares, my father loves me, but he's impossible. He only hears his own opinion. I can only stand being in the village a couple of days. They can't understand why I travel, why I love reefs. What do you want to do? She says, I love diving most of all. I have advanced certification. I just spent 2 months in Malapascua. Only the world underwater is perfect and calms me, she admits. Soon I must return to Belgium. What will you do? I ask. Later, packs on, I hug Maria, wish her bonne chance. One of the funnest things I did was a few colleagues in the last decade I was here were trips, overnight trips. I did, and Sheila Thomas is a dear friend. Sheila Roberts. See, this is why I retired, because I'm losing it. And Sheila was an English major, but then the inner geological self came out, and that's what she ended up doing for all of her graduate work, and that's what she taught here. But we did some trips together, and one trip was through Southern Idaho, and I made up a class called the Literature of Southern Idaho. That's a laugh cue, I'm just kidding. And the theme was English majors can camp. You know, we can be cool like geology students and be off, you know, a lot. And then we went to Death Valley, and then with John Exanthopoulos, I got to do some of the best things I ever did in the 40 years, which was take students and community members to Greece twice. We went on these 2 trips, and that's absolutely a highlight of my life, as Yanni knows. Ευχαριστώ. And then the last year, I did a trip with Wendy Ridenour, she had organized most of this. It was a tropical reef ecology class. So we just made that a little bit more interdisciplinary. So we were going to Belize and going to a reef 10 miles offshore for 10 days. And most of these people were science majors, and they were going to start doing a lot more journaling and reading than they wanted to. So it was called Introductory Creative Writing in Tropical Reef Ecology. And it was good. And this poem came out of one of those experiences. We would, you know, go off. It was a rough job, you know, snorkeling about 3 times a day, and then you really burn up the calories. So then you just eat that much more, and the bar opens about 4 o'clock, and they may or may not be 21, and it really doesn't matter in Belize, especially if you're on a 2-acre key 12 miles offshore. There was a night snorkel, and this poem is called Circle of Light. The students and I drift out of our single file during the night snorkel. Torches off. We circle up, clasp hands, lean back, and fin kick to stir fire algae into frothy bioluminescence. We hold tight, yet strain apart, apt metaphor for human ties, as I tilt back for the brighter light shed by the drenched night sky's stream of stars. The last section of this book is called Home Ground, and as I mentioned earlier, I'm a Puget Sound kid, and the poetry editor here thinks that these were some of the most emotional poems, I guess. And so he thought that the strongest section should, have you ever heard of this before? At the beginning of the book and at the end of the book, and good luck in between. So I'm going to read you a couple from the last section and then one last poem. This poem is called Splitting Wood, and like a lot of you, I suspect in this room, I grew up splitting wood in my at the cabin that I bought out my siblings from on Camano Island, which is an hour north of Seattle, and which my parents bought this property on in 1957. So this is what I call my oldest geography, and I have my dad's sledgehammer and 2 mauls, and they're only 60 or 80 years old or something like that, but that's what I still use. Splitting wood. I swing the old maul onto the wedge poised over a round of western hemlock at the head of the grass driveway, and half a century slips off. My father says, keep a steady pace. Don't lift the maul too high. Hit square on the wedge. Use the least effort to open the wood. Follow any hairline cracks and watch out for knots. His soft baritone guides my chubby body as I learn the sharp strike of maul on wedge, the swing of the double-bitted axe. Keep your legs spread. Face the round directly and drop the blade where your eye directs. My older brother and I split and stack quarter rounds for the shallow fireplace, kindling for the old stove. Now, solo, I alternate 2 wedges, open the blonde hemlock sections like orange segments. I think of Frost with his bum axe helve and his woodpile. Hemlock scent along with smoky, sweet western red cedar swirls around my nose, and my father, dead 20 years, stands at my side, though I have reached mid-60s. I haul the new chunks with a flatbed wooden wheelbarrow he built hell first out, and build 2 decks atop level pole runners. As I dovetail the ends, I no longer know whose hands place the flat halves. So in the increasingly unpredictable weather cycles that we live in, it turns out now whales, California gray whales, or an occasional humpback stray into our kind of big dead-end bay in mid-Puget Sound. Normally it's spring migrations, but sometimes they're around in the summer. And this was a whale who visited in the early evening. And have any of you guys been near whales when they breach and blow? And the sound effect here is something that fascinates me, because it seems like this incredible gravitational attraction. As soon as you hear a whale, these are brother or sister mammals after all, the big ones. And at least at our beach, people start running if there's a whale to be heard or sighted. This poem is called Evening Visitation. I step on the front porch and the California gray whale blows, and a wet sigh spreads over the bay and low sky. Mid-evening, steel wool clouds, the bottoms bright from shore lights that be the bay, whose glass surface pulls sound close in the silence. The whale fins gently, rolls and bottom feeds, dimly visible, and its spouting gathers us inside itself, baptized by its breath. So I'll just read one more poem, and then we can talk or figure out how to stay warm. And you can go buy books from my dear friend Debbie and support a struggling writer, for God's sakes. But this poem's about my adopted state, which I've come to love at least as deeply as my first state. And I'm terrible on horseback, but a couple of Butte friends twisted my arm badly a couple of summers ago, and I discovered I was on a horseback trip in the Snowcrest Range for 3 days and 2 nights. And it's a lot more complicated with horses, isn't it? If you lose sight of the trail, this is holy shit. It's not, okay, let's just thread our way through here. Oh, no, no, no. Now you get out the saw, you get out the pruner, or you have Weltzien go off and scout for 2 hours and 3 miles to find wherever the hell the trail is supposed to be. But have any of you spent any time in the Snowcrest Range? We've lived here a long time, and the greatest blessing to me about Montana is the backcountry. And the biggest public land unit, should I remind you, in the state is in our backyard. The Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest is the biggest thing. 3.3 million acres, and it's for us. It's just all here. And I like to go in my immaturity up above 10,000 feet whenever possible. I like to go above tree line. And those 360 views, lakes are fantastic, but 360 views are even better. And we got a few of those on this trip with these horses, which had a habit of trying to run away from us sometimes, I guess. Devil's Hole is the name of a spot on the west side of the Snowcrest Range. And the Snowcrest Range is about, 40 miles southeast? You see it if you drive up the Blacktail. There are 3 or 4 prominent peaks there. And it's a fantastic area that's been recommended for wilderness, by the way, for quite a while. So this is dedicated to a couple of those people who twisted my arm. And Charlie O'Leary, one of them thought he could make me into a cowboy. So what kind of joke that is. And this is called Big Sky Country. And ours is the only state that for 2 generations had the name of a novel on the license plate. Just reminding you. That was A.B. Guthrie, 1961. No one else had it. There are plenty of places you know better than I that could claim Big Sky, but we got it. We got it from a 1947 novel, and then we got it on the license plates for most of the last 40 years of the last century. So I tried to avoid that term, although I'm deeply invested in it, emotionally invested in it, but I decided to finally use it here. Out of Devil's Hole, we angle along steep sage slopes, our 3 horses and pack horse, a sure-footed quartet, and the old Snowcrest Trail bends north, then east, then north, and eyes pivot from thick patches of white columbine to endless spaces with few roads and fewer sheds in sight. Thunder rumbles, and shafts of virga almost kiss ground. Elsewhere, local rain, a narrow white sheen, drops below purpling clouds that blow away from us. Canyons and flats and ridges swell beyond recognition, and though we ride high, we diminish, a moving speck above endless swaths of country bereft of people, and we rise above broad sage bands, float above saddles and sere sage benches, dance along vistas we share with no one. Problems, like crowds, fade beyond our vision. In big sky country, the land's scale shrinks our shadows, mocks our footprint, and we disappear into the distance. Thank you for being here. Okay, now we can enjoy ourselves.
Just gonna take this off because I'm not that tall. Thank you so much, Ellen. Thank you all for coming to our very first OL and Weltzien Writer Series event. We're planning more come spring and next year, and look forward to relaunching after a couple of years with not much going on thanks to COVID and other chaos. So thank you so much. Please go and check out Alan's books, and we look forward to seeing you again in the spring. Enjoy the winter.
Christmas is coming.